At the root of all unwholesome states, there is one thing that leads to our renewed existence in samsara. That one thing is the reason why we fall back to lower states, no matter how virtuous we behave. Without removing ignorance, or avijja, we have no hope of a permanent freedom from suffering. Today, we try to understand what avijja really is and why most people cannot see it, even if they try. Well, first, avijja is usually translated as either delusion or ignorance, and both words are good in some aspects and not so good in other aspects. I personally like to use the word distraction to highlight the active role we play in the process of continuing our life in samsara, so to speak. That kind of relies on delusion just as much as it relies on greed and aversion. And however, let us first have a look at how people typically think of avijja. More often than not, delusion, or avijja, is regarded as a lack of knowledge of some kind when someone starts new in their practice. We have we know too little about the Dhamma, and once we have learned enough, we are no longer deluded. So keep learning, right? Well, in a sense, yes. In another sense, not so much, but more on that later. In essence, avijja is not really about a lack of knowledge, but it's an attitude of yours. It's part of craving. But first, a few synonyms and the definition that I like to go by, so we are on the same page. As mentioned, the main translation would be delusion, ignorance, and sometimes unawareness or nescience. As some aspects of those three words are good, it is hard to find a translation that fits all needs, hence I prefer no translation at all. I simply like to go by avijja. Yet, that can be difficult at times, so I prefer simple translations or terms like distraction. In short, avijja means that we not only do not know or see the truth of Dhamma, but that we are also actively distracting us from seeing the truth. Avijja is an active attitude that we maintain over and over through our own actions of greed, aversion, and in this case, especially delusion. Delusion would be a kind of distraction from the truth of Dhamma that is right in front of our eyes. Technically, the Dhamma, as the nature of all things, in quotation marks, or the true nature of reality, is always there and ready to be discerned, inviting and beneficial, but it can only be discerned by the virtuous and wise. This kind of discernment requires prior training and a thorough deconditioning of our past attitudes and habits of greed, aversion, and delusion. Ignorance is a direct result of our attitude of distraction by various different means. We distract ourselves through actions of lust, actions of hatred, and simply distracting actions on the level of body, speech, and mind. If those distractions would cease, we would have no choice but to see the Dhamma, as it automatically comes to the foreground if we stop looking away. It is always right there. This is why why it is only natural for virtuous people to know and see, as the suttas quite often say. You fortify your wisdom by your virtue and your samadhi. And this is very important. And thus a breakthrough to the Dhamma requires pretty much just two things, two ingredients. First, stopping your habit of actively looking elsewhere, and second, the help of another experienced person who points us towards what we must see or recognize. So they say to us what we should look for, and then all we have to do is stop our habits of looking elsewhere, and then we will recognize, because someone else has pointed us to it. And without that instruction, we would not know who to look for, and it is nigh impossible to discern the right things. Yet, as we have a Buddha and his Dhamma, that part is surprisingly easy and easily provided. Without a Buddha, it would be bordering the impossible. It would be a bit like trying to identify a banana in a basket of fruit without knowing what a banana or fruit even is. And that fruit basket would be infinitely big, and there would be infinitely many fruit in there, so to speak. So it would be very difficult. Anyway, in more simple terms, we need sati, mindfulness, or remembering the teaching from another person, and samadhi, or a very calm mind that is no longer distracting itself from the Dhamma, from the truth. Those are the two ingredients that you need. Not looking away from the Dhamma, and then recognizing the Dhamma based on instructions of another, discernment and samadhi. And in that context, I like to go back to the original meaning of samadhi, sati, which is just remembering. Remembering what? The teachings as we have heard them from another person who has understood them. Every meditation instruction that the suttas present you with kind of start with bringing mindfulness to the force, which just means bringing the instructions back to mind that they have received. You go to the forest, to an empty hut, and then you remember the teaching. You remember what you must do or not do. And based on that, we can further reduce our craving and clinging, which will eventually lead to a state of samadhi, where the mind is no longer moved by anything in the entire world. No central object has any capacity to move the mind out of its unified state. So when you no longer look away and know through others what to look for, you will just see with next to no effort. It is absolutely the most natural thing in the world to see the Dhamma with a mind that is virtuous and immersed in samadhi. Yet the Buddha named another thing very early in his training, and that is virtue. And what is virtue? The gradual training of stopping all the actions of distraction that later culminates in samadhi. Right samadhi is the last step of the Noble Eightfold Path and comes pretty much last as a point of convergence of all the prior factors and all the prior training. Yet that right samadhi comes to be through the training. And if samadhi is a complete untriggerability of the mind, then virtue is the cultivation of the partial immovability of the mind until the mind becomes untriggerable. You simply decondition all those default actions in response to your own feelings that you would usually do. Those actions are the most immediate fuel of ignorance, because those actions fuel the habit of looking elsewhere, of looking away from the Dhamma, of being occupied with something else. And whenever you are occupied with something else and seek for a solution there, then you have no capacity to look for the Dhamma. We can also look at it from another angle of the three types of feelings, the good, bad, and neutral feeling. To those three, we have three different default attitudes. The good feeling, we respond to with lust. To the bad feeling, with aversion, and to the neutral, with very immediate distraction. All of them are a kind of distraction of gross and subtle kinds and lead to looking away. It fuels looking away. And once we are no longer swayed by any feeling, we see the Dhamma, because it is always there. But that requires a lot of gradual cultivation, as we do not even notice or know that we are doing such things. They are that habitual and that deeply ingrained that we are no longer even aware of it. It's a bit like breathing. We are so deeply involved in greed, aversion, and delusion that we do not even notice it on the level of breathing. This is a level of automaticity that it exists upon. And the Buddha compared it in a simile from the Anguttara Nikaya, Book of the Threes, number 10, with purifying gold, getting rid of all our defilements of greed, aversion, and delusion. And he further categorized them a bit more. He said, monks, they are gross defilements of gold, soil, grit, and gravel. Now the soil remover or his apprentice washes, rinses, and cleans it. And then the middle and fine grit and coarse sands, fine and sand and black dusts. And then, only when all those defilements have been removed from the gold or from the mind, he starts smelting the gold. And then the dross has been removed. So too, monks, gross defilements, bodily, verbal, and mental misconduct, sensual thoughts, thoughts of ill will, and thoughts of harming, thoughts about his relations, thoughts about the country, and thoughts about his reputation. And only when all those middle strong defilements have been removed, there comes a time when his mind becomes internally steady, composed, unified, and concentrated. So you will gradually remove many, many, many defilements of the mind until there's nothing left. And then, only then, will the mind be immersed in samadhi. Samadhi, as the suttas explain it, is not a state on the cushion. Jhana is not just some cushion-bound exercise that you do for 2 hours each day. It is a culmination of an entire lifestyle of non-craving, an entire lifestyle of training the mind in a way that you can live without and prefer living without craving. And in a very direct sense, we are creating our very own suffering. We keep it alive by looking away from the Dhamma, by distracting ourselves from the Dhamma. Through our actions and habits of craving, we ignore the fact that we are directly fueling our own suffering. We do our suffering. An end to suffering is only possible because we are actively doing it. It is 100% on us, so to speak. That is the only reason why we can even influence it, because that suffering is ours. Everything else, not so much. But the suffering, that comes about through our actions that fuel it. Avijja is a sankhara. It has a basis. It needs for its continued existence. And that basis is in our actions and in our ignorance. A combination of our actions and our ignorance. Otherwise, we would just know and see the Dhamma. Avijja needs constant fuel to stay alive. Yet it's a very persistent kind of sankhara, a very persistent kind of habit not being liberated, so to speak. And the suttas even say that we keep ourselves in a maimed and injured condition, and that is exactly how it is. Suffering and self are very real to all those who have not trained otherwise. Things are not real just because they can be stopped. Playing tennis is very real as long as we do it. Nobody in their right mind would say that it is not real just because it can be stopped. Yet that is one of the traps people fall into quite frequently. They either deny the self and suffering or completely embrace it. Yet they do not see the conditioned middle ground. With ignorance, there is suffering in self. Without ignorance, those things cease. When there's a little ignorance, there's a little suffering and a little self, and so on. It's a conditioned statement. If you would stop providing that fuel, the Dhamma would automatically become apparent without you having to do anything at all. You don't have to actively contemplate, you don't have to actively remember, you don't have to do anything. It will be just there in your face. This is how the practice can unfold naturally. Given your weakening of craving, you will see more and more. If there is no craving, there is no long time any blind spot or old fetter remaining. If you dwell in a state without craving long enough, you simply cannot go back, because craving in itself was impossible, so to speak, to begin with. You cannot be satisfied. At that point, nothing can trigger you into going back anymore, and your work would be finished. Then, only then, are you truly beyond training. This is why you are 100% responsible for your own suffering. You are keeping it on life support through your actions of greed, aversion, and delusion. It is the fuel of suffering. Nothing and no one else is to blame, really, even if there's a horrible condition in the world. The suffering part would be on you. The bad feeling, yeah, well, maybe that's on the world. But the suffering from the bad feeling, that is on you. We just always get baited back into blaming something or someone else. You won't do it because you want to, but you do it because you don't know any better, because you are deluded in a sense and have been for so long. Accepting our role in the process is very liberating, even if unpleasant at first. An end to suffering really is possible after all. We can only change what we are responsible for. Yet when we start, the only clumsy way of making the pressure of craving go away is through giving in, and we thus reinforce the entire process and make craving even stronger. Yet, if we have confidence in the liberation of another person, we can drop our old method for long enough to try something else. This works even better based on a divine messenger that shows you that sensuality does not work. Then you can put in the work of training in virtue through renunciation and the untangling of the web of our wrong views. We stop all those actions of greed, aversion, and delusion that fuel our non-seeing of the Four Noble Truths. We don't see how we cause our suffering. If we would see it, we would stop. When all that is gone, only right view remains, and we understand exactly how we create our own suffering and how to stop it. We understand wholesome and unwholesome. We understand liberation from suffering. That is truly the ultimate knowledge, and with it comes the greatest relief, the relief of the Dhamma that the Buddha was talking about. But enough on that. Let us now come to the most important part. First, most people misunderstand Avijja as a lack of knowledge. However, it is a wrong attitude, a habit of distraction. Through greed, aversion, and delusion, we look away from how we maintain our own suffering, from how we fuel our own suffering. If we understand this, we stop fueling the entire process, and it will come to an end sooner or later. The process, the point of no return is stream entry, where you have truly understood that you have been doing it all along, and then you stop. And in a very limited amount of time, the entire process will come to an end. And this path requires a lot of effort and patience, but in the end, it yields the highest fruit of liberation from all kinds of suffering. No matter what, even if highway robbers would saw you apart limb by limb, you would not suffer. And there's nothing I know in any other kind of religion or spiritual striving that could achieve that, but the liberation that the Dhamma can offer. But anyway, this should be enough for today. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoy what we do here, feel free to like and subscribe. If you have any additional questions, feel free to post them down below. But until then, I wish you a pleasant day and goodbye.